This weekend the podcast goes out marks the 110th anniversary of the Battle of Loos in 1915. And a decade ago, I was on that battlefield commemorating the centenary of Loos and visiting dozens of locations with people who had family connections to them. And that's always a privilege to do. This wasn't just people who had family members who were killed at Loos in 1915, but in many cases they were people where grandfathers and great-grandfathers survived, and the stories of their deeds had been passed down through those families, and a century on, they wanted to stand on that same ground. This year I won't make it out to Loos, but Loos and those wider battlefields across northern France have always particularly fascinated me, and we've covered quite a lot of them in episodes of The Old Front Line. They form an area that has become commonly known as the Forgotten Front, the battlefields between Flanders and Arras, and an area generally much less visited. There are, of course, many forgotten fronts of the Great War, from Salonika to Mesopotamia and Palestine, but this is not those. This is a part of the Western Front. So what is the Forgotten Front, and what does it mean? And what does it tell us, I guess, about the battlefields of the Great War and the experience and history of the Great War on the Western Front? Back when I started my original Old Front Line website, which is way back in 1999, in the early days of the internet, and I was still living, of course, then at Courcelette, and in those days we accessed the internet via dial-up, believe it or not. I'd been reading something during the preparation of putting that website together, which contained information about the battlefields and what to see, what you could find, and reading some material on that ground between Armentières and Loos, I saw a reference to it as a forgotten part of the former battlefields. So I added a section to that website called the Forgotten Front, and that term kind of took hold, and I've seen it used frequently ever since, which is great because it gives an area, part of that landscape of the First World War, an identity, and it also perhaps provokes people to go and study it and visit it too. But when we refer to the Forgotten Front, what do we mean? What area does it cover? So in this episode, we'll have an overview of the Forgotten Front, look at some of the areas it covers, look at its geography, if you like, and hopefully this will push me on a bit. This coming winter, I'll get myself back to working on my book, my Battleground Europe book, on the subject of the Forgotten Front, and finally finish it off, especially as I've been promising this book for so long. But, and this isn't an excuse, there is a thing called the Old Front Line podcast, and that has somehow gotten in the way of me finishing this book. Writing a book is a mighty task and a time-consuming one as well. But the book's about 85% finished, so I'm going to try and crack on. Anyway, back to the podcast, and it's time once more to strap on our virtual boots, pull on our virtual pack, and head out onto that area of northern France that overlooks the Belgian border, true north on that Forgotten Front, and begin our journey there. In the years after the First World War, the Battle Nomenclature Committee divided up the battles of the Great War so that historians, future historians, current historians then could make sense of those 4 long years of conflict. And this is what historians do to understand the past. They often use names that, to the men on the ground at the time, probably wouldn't have made much sense, but those are the names by which we know these battles more than a century later. And in some ways, when we look at a part of the Western Front like this, it's good to do that with the Forgotten Front. So what we'll do here with this podcast is divide it into 2 battlefield areas and one area behind the lines, because that part of the old front line, away from the main battlefield area, is just as important as the main battlefields themselves, as we've often said on this podcast. The first area that we're going to look at covers the ground from near the town of Armentières, down to the ground around the town of Bassée. And that makes sense, I think, because to the northeast of the town of Armentières, there is a border, the border with Belgium, where we're kind of beginning our virtual journey. And to the south, near Bassée, is a natural feature, in fact a man-made feature, canal, the Bassée Canal, which divides that bit of ground. Divides it from a military point of view as to where the British lines were in the early period of the war, but also the geography of that part of northern France, because beyond the Bassée Canal into the next sector, you begin to see a change in that geography, as we'll discuss. So starting in this northern area, what are the key features when we look at this part of the Forgotten Front? Well, in terms of the geography from Armentières down to the Bassée area, from the Belgian border, you've got an area of farmland there, moving out across what is essentially the flatlands of French Flanders, and long Roman roads in this area, which is typical of this part of northern France, crisscrossed in places by rivers and streams and also canals. And then when we look at the wider geography coming across what is essentially a very flat landscape, we see the dominance of any kind of high ground that's there. And when we speak about high ground in this area, like we would do if we were in Flanders, in Belgium, we're looking at high ground that is only tens of meters above sea level. And whoever occupies that high ground in this kind of landscape will have dominance. And this area, this first area, from beyond Armentières down towards Bassée, is dominated by a low ridge, in this case, the Albers Ridge. Now, when we look at the establishment of the line here, looking at the history side of this, there's heavy fighting here in October 1914. This is the period of the German so-called race to the sea, as German forces are moving through northern France and also to the north in Flanders as well, heading towards the Channel coast. The British and the French, what's left of the Belgian army, is fighting in all of those areas, and here around Armentières there are British soldiers, in this case utilising that low ridge, that Albers Ridge, as part of their defence, taking over farmland and villages just beyond it as the Germans advance from the direction of the city of Lille. And the eastern side of that ridge, the other side of it essentially, is where a lot of small and some quite considerable engagements are fought in that early period of October 1914. Now, the Germans have numbers behind them. The British being pushed back, losing heavy casualties in some of these battles, means they can't hold on to this ground indefinitely. So in that early phase of the fighting here, that high ground is lost, the Germans take control of it, and the British pull back into similar kind of farmland beyond, crisscrossed by these streams and rivers with roads and small villages, and dig in that area. That is where, in this part of northern France, British troops begin to dig their first trenches as their comrades to the north beyond Armentières, across that border, are doing exactly the same thing in Flanders near to Ypres. And this sees in that early phase, that first winter of 1914-15, the construction of the initial British line on the Western Front, and the deadlock essentially of trench warfare as the mobile war comes to an end. And that deadlock, that static warfare, would mean that this sector becomes one of the main British and later Commonwealth Empire areas of learning about the static nature of trench warfare on the Western Front. It becomes what some units call a nursery sector, where units arriving on the Western Front for the first time from training in Britain in the early phase of the war are put into what is a static front like this with no major battles going on. They can learn to take over trenches, understand how the trench system operates, what happens on a day-to-day basis, and they can do that while limiting their casualties. If they were just thrown into battle for the first time, then that would probably be a disaster. But if they're on a quiet, so-called quiet front like this, they can understand what trench warfare, in theory, what trench warfare is all about. And that was done a lot in that early period of the war and continued well into 1916, when Australian and New Zealand forces, for example, came to France from Egypt, having served in Gallipoli the previous year. So it's an important part of the front in that respect because it saw a high rotation of units, and many soldiers who went on to fight in the big battles like the Somme and Ypres and Arras and many other places besides did their kind of grounding, if you like, in trench warfare in sectors like this, if not this actual sector that we're going to virtually walk down now. It was also, aside from being for a big long period of the war a quiet static front, it was also the scene of some of the initial British offensives on the Western Front between March and September 1915. The British, faced with static trench warfare, didn't intend just to sit there and do nothing. And what you see in that early part of 1915 is an attempt to get to grips with trying to break the deadlock of the Western Front, and sometimes achieving small breakthroughs, often at a high cost, but learning the lessons of that kind of offensive fighting as it develops, as the whole front develops and the way of fighting on the Western Front develops in that early period of the Great War. And while after that there are long years with no major battles, with one or two exceptions taking place, fighting returns to this front in 1918 with a vengeance, with the German offensive in what became known as the Battle of the Loos in April 1918. And although the Germans didn't effect the breakthrough, the total breakthrough that they wished, they pushed the lines right back into areas where there'd never been any fighting at all. And there was a period of static warfare again until the Allies mustered for a counter-offensive, and this ground saw fighting again in September 1918, leading to the breakout of trench warfare in this area and the advance over open ground to roll up cities like Lille, which had been behind the German lines since October of 1914. So that's a kind of overview of what we find here from a geographical point of view and from the kind of history point of view, not untypical of many of these quieter fronts along the Western Front in the Great War. But what do we find on these battlefields today as we make our way along this first part of the Forgotten Front from Armentières down to the Bassée Canal? Well, first we have to kind of step over the border a bit into Belgium, because there is a memorial. In fact, there are several memorials to the missing, commemorating men who died on this part of the Forgotten Front. And one of them was originally going to be sited in the city of Lille, which we've mentioned. I guess it would have been called the Lille Memorial, but there was no space for it. And that instead became what we know today as the Plugstert Memorial, the Plug Street Memorial, which commemorates 11,334 British soldiers and 13 South Africans who were killed between October 1914, and the end of the war. Now, the area that it covers is denominated by two rivers, one in Belgium, just to the north of Plugstert and near to the town of Messines, and then to the south it is the Loos River, the Loos Brook. And in that area, the missing from that sector are pretty much all commemorated on the Plugstert Memorial to the missing. I say pretty much all because there is another memorial to the missing in this area, the La Tour Memorial, and that commemorates 13,500 British soldiers who fell in this grounds that we're going to travel along now from Armentières down towards La Bassée, but covering a narrower time frame, in this case from October 1914 to the 24th of September 1915, when the Loos Memorial, which we'll also see, takes over. Now, there's a bit of a crossover in this area, this first area, between the Plugstert Memorial and the La Tour. In some respects, there are some men commemorated on Plugstert who probably should be on La Tour, and some men commemorated on La Tour who are commemorated on the Plugstert Memorial. And this kind of thing happened quite a lot. The vast casualties that were suffered in the Great War and the attempt to get this right wasn't always successful in the days where they relied, of course, on paper records. But for this initial area, these are the two memorials to the missing that dominate. So when we look at those early British offensives like Neuve Chapelle, Festubert and Albers Ridge, this is where we find the missing on those two great memorials. Now, in terms of Armentières, the front line was just outside the town, in small little villages close to junctions of roads and sometimes railway lines, and in that typical landscape crisscrossed by these small rivers and streams. And you'll find there quite a lot of battlefield cemeteries, which are sited close to where quite a lot of the front lines were located. This flat landscape, there was a big problem with digging in here. If you dug deep trenches, they would often flood. So a lot of the trench systems here were breastworks with positions built up above ground level. And in Armentières itself, Armentières, home of the famous Mademoiselle from Armentières, this was a place which the British Army used in this northern sector as its main route to the front line, its kind of command and control area. So there were headquarters here, medical facilities, ammunition and supply depots to take material out onto the frontline area on the outskirts of the town. Men came and went from the trenches through the town itself, through the main square. Today, not as famous as Ypres or Albert, but the main square was known as 11 o'clock square because the clock tower of the town hall had been hit by a shell and was stuck on 11 o'clock until eventually, of course, that clock tower and the clock with it all came down with the amount of shells that eventually dropped on Armentières. So for the soldiers in this sector, for the veterans that I interviewed back in the 80s and 90s, for example, they would often refer to this as the Armentières sector. That's what they kind of identified. They didn't always know the names of the villages where they actually were. And when we get out into those areas, there are some names that stand out more than others. There's Bois Grenier, which was an area where the British took over in 1914, having been pushed back by the German advance, dug in there, took over that village, and we kind of see an echo of the landscape and the infrastructure of the front line, with some cemeteries right out where the forward trenches were, and then others in the town itself. And typical of the cemeteries in this area, in that they don't contain the graves of men killed in big offensives necessarily. In fact, the majority aren't. They're men killed in those day-to-day activities of trench warfare. Snipers, rifle grenades, trench mortars coming over, random artillery barrages. Both sides tunnelled on this sector quite a lot. There was a lot of mining activity beneath the battlefield, and in some cases mines were blown. Soldiers were killed in the explosion of those. So the kind of reasons and causes of death that we find amongst casualties buried in these cemeteries are much more varied than if we went to the big offensive cemeteries in places like Ypres and the Somme. And when we get down to the ground beyond these villages and up onto the Albers Ridge, we can begin to see the dominance of that so-called high ground. Again, we're only tens of metres above sea level, but we can see down into villages like Bois Grenier and Fleurbay, and we can see why the Germans were so keen to possess this kind of high ground here, because of the view that it gave them. And up on top of it, when we travel along the roads that take us across that Albers Ridge into, for example, Albers Village, which is the village that gives the ridge its name, we find a lot of German concrete structures from the First World War, from fairly small shelters that sheltered men and equipment, to artillery positions, to mortar positions, to much bigger concrete structures that were observation posts, to concrete towers that were built up inside silos and factory buildings, many of which are still there, the concrete towers, the buildings themselves, long since blasted away. And as you come into Albers, for example, I remember the first time I went there, The sun was on the other side of the village, and as we drove in, there looked to be this old kind of cottage on the outskirts of the village itself. And as we got nearer to it, we realised that it was a bunker that had been built inside a cottage. The cottage long since blasted away, but the shape of it was still there in concrete. And that was quite accessible in those days. And we went in there, got up into the upper sections where the Germans had an observation post, and the wooden mount for periscopes or a telescope was still in there in those days. Little had it changed since the time of the aftermath of the First World War. So there's a huge number of these concrete structures. I was once told that there are at least 2,000 of them between Armentières and Bassée on the German side of the battlefield. And the interesting thing, on the British side, who traditionally didn't build concrete structures, because this was a static front, you see quite a lot of British bunkers here, which is a kind of testimony to the fact that the British accepted that there probably wasn't going to be a great advance here until that point in the war, when fronts like this would collapse and the war was probably coming to an end. And that was true because all of this was finally broken and traversed and pushed back and moved beyond in those final months of the conflict in 1918. Now, we've said that after the British offensives here in that early part of 1915, from Neuve-Chapelle through to Albers and Festubert, it was a quiet sector for such a long time, but there were occasions in which there were major battles and engagements. Fromelles is a good example of that, where in 1915 the British attacked as part of the Battle of Albers Ridge. This was kind of towards the left flank of that assault, and there were a lot of casualties in the fighting here, mines blown, some breakthrough into the German positions, but those attacks forced back. And then the Australians had a second advance in this area in July of 1916, when the 5th Australian Division, alongside the British 61st Division, made an attack on Fromelles village as part of one of those diversionary battles for the Battle of the Somme. For the Australians, this was one of the most costly periods of their military history, with a staggering number of Australian casualties, leading many years later to the memorialisation of this ground with the construction of an Australian memorial park with ground given by local farmers, and the formation of an association here to build a monument, the stunning Cobbers Memorial, that bronze figure of an Australian soldier carrying in one of his mates over his shoulders, that was part of the stunning work by Australian sculptor Peter Corlett, and an area that I think focused quite a lot of Australian attention and study into this period of the Australian involvement on the Western Front, a kind of a forgotten battle within a forgotten front. And it led as well to the incredible search for the missing in this area, and the discovery of a mass grave of Australian soldiers, and the construction of the first Great War Commonwealth War Cemetery, Pheasant Wood Cemetery, since the 1930s, when the bodies of those soldiers who were recovered, many of whom were identified, were laid to rest there. And there's a fantastic museum alongside that as well, which you can visit as part of traversing this sector of the Forgotten Front. But as we come down off the top of the ridge into the area beneath it, we come down into some of those key villages, that key ground connected with those early offensives on the Western Front, Neuve-Chapelle being a good example of that. We've done some previous podcast episodes about the Indian Corps at Neuve-Chapelle. This was one of those areas where they went into battle for the first time in 1914, and then in the March 1915 battle played a massive role, a major role in the attack here, in sweeping up the German ground and breaking through into the positions beyond. Neuve-Chapelle was in fact quite a successful battle for the first British offensive on the Western Front, but the success couldn't easily be exploited. This is one of the great problems for First World War commanders, was breaking through the enemy lines. How do you exploit it? By bringing up enough men, enough ammunition, enough equipment to push that on to wherever it's going to take you. In most cases, it ended with a small amount of sudden success and then back to stalemate, and the line then settled down around Neuve-Chapelle for a big chunk of the rest of the war. And just down the road, beyond the crossroads, La Bombe crossroads at Neuve-Chapelle, you come up to the ground where the Boar's Head is located, something I've spoken about many times. The day Sussex died, the South Downs Battalion's diversionary attack there on the 30th of June 1916. And again, that's also in an area where troops attacked on the 9th of May 1915 in the Battle of Albers Ridge. The 5th Royal Sussex and Cinque Ports Battalion famously advanced there into the German positions, and that with the Battle of 1915 with the 2nd and 5th Battalions advancing at Albers Ridge, and then the South Downs in 1916 with the attack on the Boar's Head. It became a corner of the forgotten front that was certainly forever part of Sussex, and certainly forever part of that Sussex heritage, leading during the centenary, in fact in the approach to the centenary, I think, the twinning between Wadhurst, which had lost so many men there in 1915, and the village of Albers, which gives the wider area and the battlefield its name. And then round the corner you have Festubert and Givenchy in that final part of this sector, leading down towards the Bassée Canal. And it's quite easy just to drive through those areas. They're pretty unremarkable, really. And in fact, what we find on some of the buildings in those villages is more evidence of the Second World War. Quite a lot of battle damage from May 1940 as British units pulled back towards the coast, towards Dunkirk, for example. But of course, the whole area, if you look at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission maps, or if you look at Google Maps, you'll see a whole network of cemeteries in this area, some unit memorials. The landscape has not really changed, so with trench maps or with the digital trench maps like Linesman, you can get out onto these battlefields and make a lot of sense of them in terms of their early war history and when the whole front became static here. And as you get down towards Givenchy, the terrain begins to change. It moves out of that kind of flat land, that ground where a lot of the trenches were breastworks built up above ground level. Givenchy, la Bassée is near to the La Bassée Canal. It sits on a bit of a rising bit of ground and was a position that was especially suitable for the war underground, for tunnelling. And it became an area choke point for that, where mine after mine after mine was being blown there, including some very sizable charges. The Red Dragon crater, the Red Dragon mine, blown by the Germans underneath the positions of the 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers in June 1916, described in some detail by Frank Richards in Old Soldiers Never Die. That's where he was decorated with the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his bravery, and also the place where beneath that battlefield at the same time William Hackett was down there of the Royal Engineers with his tunnellers. The tunnel system that they'd been working on was collapsed by the explosion of the Red Dragon mine, and he stayed at his post trying to get the lads out until the whole system collapsed, and he was killed and eventually awarded the posthumous Victoria Cross for his bravery, the only tunneller in the Great War to get that distinction. Commemorated today by a modern memorial that overlooks the site where the Red Dragon crater was. It's quite an effective memorial in that it's got the symbol of the tunnellers, which is the T, in a bit of glass, and as you look through that glass, it takes your eye out to the bit of the field where the crater was, and beneath it, where Hackett and the other tunnellers were doing their work and where his brave deed took place. So there's much to find, really, as you traverse this. And again, in some of these areas, like Festubert, there is a good example of a British bunker there, a massive one, covered in ivy these days, but still discernible. And if you look at some of the early editions of Rose Coombs, she shows pictures of a French woman still living in that bunker in the 1960s and 70s. It's quite a sizable command headquarters signals bunker, I suspect, but one of a number. And the 55th West Lancs Division, who operate in this area quite a lot in both 1917 and 18, and we see their service reflected in the dead from that division that we find in the cemeteries in this area, but we also see quite a lot of concrete structures that their engineers built with the divisional flash, the Rose of Lancaster, kind of carved into the concrete. That's something that you'll see in quite a few locations here. And for them, in April 1918, during that German offensive, this was part of the front that they were defending at that time. And while the whole front to the north, from north of Givenchy all the way up past Armentières, up into Belgian Flanders, while all of that collapsed, the 55th West Lancs Division held the ground here around the Bassée Canal. And in this sector, the Germans did not effect a breakthrough. So when it came to memorialising the division, territorial division, so a lot of local connections, battalions recruited locally, with a good old comrades association after the war, one of the earliest divisional histories that was published in 1919, only a small one, but a really good one, fold out maps and photographs. And that, as I've often said, leads to a divisional memorial, where are we going to build a memorial to the 55th West Lancs Division? Our finest hours at Givenchy. Givenchy is going to be the place where it goes up, and that's where you'll find it today. And there was a huge commemoration when that was unveiled, with a lot of ex-members of the battalions of the 55th Division and men who were still in what was by then the Territorial Army, came out in uniform, and the memorial was unveiled. Not as well known as others, but nevertheless it kind of marks an important period in the history of territorial units in the Great War, and also the incredible battle that was fought here in April of 1918 as part of the Battle of the Loos. Now, in terms of La Bassée town, we're coming up to our dividing line now in this first sector of the Forgotten Front, divided, as we've said, by the La Bassée Canal. La Bassée is the nearby town. It was swept up in the German advance in October 1914 and remained in German hands until that final phase of the war in the autumn of 1918. But it was a town that could be seen from many of the British trenches. So again, a little bit like Armentières, when soldiers spoke about the front that they were on, if they were down here, they often called this the La Bassée front. And you'll read that in memoirs by Frank Richards, who we've already mentioned, and Robert Graves, goodbye to all that, and many, many others besides. But whenever I come here, whenever I've brought groups to this area, I don't always read a lot of war poetry to groups, because not everyone likes war poetry. Certainly some of the more complex poetry by Sassoon and Graves and Owen, it's difficult for some people to understand. But many years ago I came across a poem written about this part of the front, and it was written in 1934 by two Great War veterans, Bernard Newman and Harold Arpthorpe. They had come back and they wrote this poem subsequently, and it's called The Road to La Bassée, and it reflects on what they found in the 30s, 20 years after the Great War, and how that made them feel about what had happened there in the 4 years of the Great War itself. Now, it's quite a long poem. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will put a link to it on the show notes for this episode if you do want to read it. I would recommend that. But this is the two stanzas that I think really kind of stand out for this, and this is the first of them. I went across to France again and walked about the line. The trenches have all been filled in. The country's looking fine. The folks gave me a welcome and lots to eat and drink, saying, "Hello, Tommy, back again. How do you do, in ze pink?" And then I walked about again and mooched about the line. You'd never think there'd been a war. The country's looking fine. But the one thing that amazed me, most shocked me, I should say, there's buses running now from Bethune to La Bassée. And I wondered what they'd think of it, those mates of mine who died. They never got to La Bassée, though God knows how they tried. I thought back to the moments when their number came around, and now those buses rattling over sacred, holy ground. Yes, I wondered what they'd think of it, those mates of mine who died, of those buses rattling over the old pavé close beside. "Carry on, that's why we died," I could almost hear them say, "to keep those buses always running from Bethune to La Bassée." And it's written in very simple language, but I think it expresses a lot about what some veterans saw as the meaning of sacrifice, that they've come back, as these two men did 20 years after the war, found the landscape changed, life gone back to normal, buses running across the old battlefields, and when they stand in the cemeteries, they can hear the voices of their mates saying, "That's what we fought for life to return as normal." And we'll stop now on this boundary of this first part of the Forgotten Front, and then resume our journey just beyond it into this second area of battlefield. Having crossed the La Bassée Canal, we've now come into the second and final area of the Forgotten Front on the actual battlefields themselves, which extends from here, where we are now, to the ground around the Bethune Lens Road to the south. Now, these are delineations made by me. They're not any official delineation of this front, but when I came to look at this and when I came to write the early part of the book that I'm working on still, I thought, how can I divide this front up? And these are the kind of obvious boundaries. The Belgian border to the north, and then the ground from Armentières to the Bassée Canal, and then from the other side of the Bassée Canal down towards the Bethune Lens Road. And then beyond that, you're getting closer to Arras in the next part of the front, essentially. Now, this was an area taken over after those early battles on the northern area of the Forgotten Front in 1915. As the size of the British Expeditionary Force grew, it was put under pressure to extend its line, extend its positions along the Western Front, and gradually in 1915, the length of the front that the British held, which initially had been about 30 miles from Saint-Éloi, just to the south of Ypres, down to that area close to La Bassée, that was then extended to take in this area that we're coming into now, into the ground close to Lens, and near to the villages of Loos, which was in German hands, and Vermelles, which was in British and prior to that French hands. So this became a new part of the British line. And some units were detached from this area of the Western Front and sent further south, because the intention was to move the British line further and further south as possible. And some of those units in 1915, as the front was being established here, were down on the Somme, for example, some south of the River Somme, and others in the area around Albert, for example. But that's a story for another day. Now, prior to this becoming a British sector of the Western Front, this is an area where the French army had fought in 1914 and 1915 in those early battles in this part of the front, but involving the French army. So when we look at the names of the villages here, and they become synonymous with long periods of trench warfare and some of the offensives here in 1915, they're also places where French soldiers were falling, often in great numbers, in those earlier battles, like Cambrin, Cuinchy, Vermelles, and Mazingarbe, for example. And we find evidence of that French part of the war here, the involvement and the casualties, in memorials and cemeteries in this area where the French dead are buried and the French dead are commemorated on unit memorials in one or two locations here as well. So again, like the northern part of the front, what are the key features when we look at this part, this next battlefield area of the Forgotten Front? Well, it's different terrain for a start. We've previously been in a kind of flat area dominated by a ridge. Here we're at the start of a chalk seam and also a very deep coal seam here. It's one of the richest coal fields in France, and we can see evidence of that coal mining industry right across this landscape today, just as the soldiers of both sides could see that over 100 years ago in 1914-15. It's very flat and open. There's not much woodland here. The fields are vast open spaces, and to the south, beyond that Lens Bethune Road, is the start of even more high ground towards the city of Arras and the beginning of the rolling downland that extends east of Arras towards Cambrai and to the south down towards what became known as the Somme battlefields. In the northernmost area where we begin our journey now, close to the Bassée Canal, there were the villages of Cambrin and Cuinchy, and in front of Cuinchy were the brick stacks. This was a massive brick factory with huge undelivered piles of bricks. We've done a previous podcast episode on the brick stacks, and the brick stacks suddenly became part of the battlefield, these massive towers that both sides took over and fought over on and off for a big chunk of the rest of the war, with assaults on individual brick stacks, with going up the sides of them on ladders and men fighting each other on the top, to very deep trenches here because you could be spied on from the top of the brick stacks by the enemy and you could do the same to your enemy. So soldiers need to be in much deeper trenches here to avoid detection from movement and anything else. And we see an attempt to try and break the stalemate here, push back from these brick stacks with French memorials to the units that fought here in 1915, and quite a big plot of French dead in Cambrin churchyard, which is also a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery from the next period of the war. And that then takes us across to the area where the Battle of Loos was fought in September and October of 1915, taken over by the British in the months before that. And we've got that vast area of open fields where the battle was fought in 1915, dominated at the time by key German features, the Hohenzollern Redoubt, as the British called it, this massive German defensive system near Auchy-les-Mines, where there was a big network of trenches. There were slag heaps the Germans had observation posts in, dominating the ground there. And there'd been a lot of mining activity there in the early period of the war, carried on up to the beginning of the Battle of Loos. It was part of the main northern area of the assault, where the 9th Scottish Division, part of the first 100,000 of Kitchener's army, the first men to enlist, went into action on the 25th of September 1915 with the other units that attacked that day. But this was their kind of battlefield with huge casualties, with staggering losses, with ordinary soldiers killed, right through to their divisional commander being killed in the battle here, Major General Thesiger, whose body was never recovered, and his name is on the Loos Memorial to the missing. And as we come to the south of where the Hohenzollern Redoubt was, we're in those big open fields. We can see, one author described it as unfavourable ground, and when you see these fields as they are today, and you try to imagine units attacking across that open ground, you can see what kind of difficulties there were. And here we've got some of the kind of famous features like the Routoir Farm, the farm that was just behind the British lines, where a lot of units assembled in the middle part of the assault on the Loos battlefield in September 1915. And in the fields just beyond it was a single tree known as the Lone Tree. It was a kind of landmark on the battlefield. Soldiers could see it from the trenches. When they went forward in the battle, they were attacking close to it. Harry Coates, who I've mentioned many times on this podcast, went over the top of the London Scottish near that position on the 25th of September 1915 and was gassed as he went forward. Saw his best mate gassed beside him and killed, and he always remembered his cold, dead eyes staring out through the gas mask eyepieces and realising that his best mate was gone. Then he took a whiff of gas himself and was evacuated back. And when the battle moved forward a bit and that ground was taken, a lot of soldiers souvenired bits of the Lone Tree. I think the London Scottish Museum has got a chunk of it in their collection, for example, not swiped by Harry Coates, and it disappeared by war's ending. And then jumping on many, many years, some members of the Western Front Association who had kind of personal connection to that bit of ground replanted it, and it's still growing there today. And there's a little memorial plaque in front of it. And it's one of those kind of landmarks, really, on the Loos battlefield today. Again, 10 years ago, for the centenary, I stood there with a group and we had fantastic weather, fantastic visibility across that ground. And you can really kind of bring the Loos battlefield to life, I think, from that location. And seeing as you can, because there is no cover, all of the key features from the Routoir Farm behind you, Vermel beyond that, and then back out onto the battlefield area, you can see Dud Corner Cemetery and the Loos Memorial to the south, the Bethune-Lens Road. You can see the spire of the church and the town hall in Loos Village and see how that village sits in a bit of a hollow. And then you can see the rising ground beyond it, leading up to what was known on the maps as Hill 70, where the next phase of the battle took place and where the Guards Division went into action for the first time in the Great War, having brought all of the Guards units into one formation. They went over the top in that battle, took part in the attack on Hill 70, and one of the more famous casualties amongst the Irish Guards who were with them in that battle was John Kipling, the son of Rudyard Kipling. One of those incredible stories of grief and the Great War, with one father's search for the fate of his son and where his son might be buried. He does have a marked grave today, but his name remains firmly on the Loos Memorial. And again, that's a kind of tale for another podcast, another day. The area to the south of the Lens-Bethune Road, which we've kind of said is a demarcation line, we can't entirely forget because that was also part of the Loos battle in 1915. The village of Cité-Maroc, Neuilly-les-Mines, Aix-Noulette, that kind of is the southern boundary. Once you get beyond Aix-Noulette, you're getting much nearer to Notre Dame de Lorette, the beginnings of the high ground around Souchez, the start of Vimy Ridge, and then, of course, beyond that, Arras. So you're really moving into the next bit of the Western Front. But just to the south, around Cité Maroc, in that area there, where there was a very large slag heap known as the Double Crassier, that was where the southern part of the Loos offensive went in. The 47th London Division, London Territorials, went into battle there, and it was a scene of, for example, footballs being kicked forward into battle by the men of the London Irish Rifles, a famous incident and one of many times during the Great War in which footballs featured in an assault on German positions. This, I think, probably one of the earliest written examples of that taking place. And this southern area is where we get a very, very good kind of evidence of the coalfields which dominate this part of northern France. The Double Crassier was reduced, I think, by the end of the First World War, and then the coal mining continued beyond right up to the 1970s. So the size of it is much bigger than it was in 1915, and then there are other slag heaps in the distance beyond it, and we can't disguise the fact that we are in a former coal mining area. You can get up onto the top of the Double Crassier today, and there are incredible views from there. It's a bit of a walk coming around the back of it, but it's well worth it because you get this incredible view right across the whole expanse of that Loos battlefield. Now, what do we find on this part of the Forgotten Front, this next battlefield sector of this part of northern France? Well, similar kind of things in many respects. The landscape is different, but we see evidence of the Great War with cemeteries and memorials, of course. I mean, as I say many, many times, they're not there by accident. They are beacons, really, to the history of the Great War, and the cemeteries kind of pointing to the fact that that is often where the fighting was at its fiercest. So if we go back to that northern area where the brick stacks were located, the brick stacks have long since disappeared. Over the years, locals have told me that they were used to fill in the shell holes and trenches and repair roads and all that kind of stuff. But I must say, in walking the fields where the brick stacks were once located, I have found bricks that are obviously from that period, so they haven't entirely disappeared. But it is quite a small area, and it's on the edge of a kind of urban area now. There was a big power station built there many years later, and the geography of that has changed. But when you walk the pathways there, and you've got a map, a trench map with you, you can see how incredibly close the front lines were. You can literally walk along a track on the edge of where that power station was, look across a field, and only tens of yards away, that's where the British front line was located. So you can get a lot, again, always get a lot by walking the ground. And then when you get down to the Hohenzollern Redoubt area, now that has changed a lot over the years that I've been visiting that part of the battlefield. There was a big clear up there in the 90s where they took away a huge amount of ground, huge amount of archaeology was exposed. I remember seeing skips full of trench shields and rifles with bayonets still on and all kinds of battlefield detritus, and a lot of very small kit just lying about all over the place. I mean, there was no battlefield archaeology in those days, sadly, so I'm sure a lot of stuff was lost. I don't remember reading about the recovery of too many human remains, so whether there wasn't really much diligence in that, I don't know. But it's an area where you can still walk and still, again, get some sense of the terrain there. A lot of the mine craters that were part of that landscape have been filled in by rubbish over the years. But when you go out to Quarry Cemetery, it was just behind where the British front line was located, and the dead were buried in a quarry there. You are right on the British front line, and you can see again how exposed that position was. And units like the 9th Scottish Division and then latterly the 46th North Midland Division, who went into the attack there in October, you can see how unit after unit could easily get chewed up there, as indeed they did in those 1915 battles. And although there isn't the kind of density of cemeteries here, they tend to be on the larger scale once you get out into the main battlefield area, with a very high proportion of the dead at the Battle of Loos in September, October 1915 having no known grave and being commemorated on the Loos Memorial to the Missing. Nevertheless, you can go to St Mary's ADS Cemetery, you can find Kipling's grave there, John Kipling, if indeed it is his grave. You'll see the high percentage of unidentified soldiers buried in there, and just across the fields is Lone Tree Cemetery, and Le Routoir Farm, which has still got some of its original walls, some of its original structures. There's a very interesting British observation bunker in the grounds of the farm. It's not on public land, but very often the farmer will open it up and let you have a look. And just from beyond the farm itself, you're back into the next bit of the battlefield, looking up towards where Dud Corner Cemetery and the Loos Memorial is located. And again, you've got this kind of sense of the vastness of the fields there, and you kind of look and you imagine those units going into battle in September 1915. As you come down into Loos Village, past Dud Corner and the Loos Memorial, where the dead are commemorated, the missing commemorated on the walls of the memorial, and many casualties within the cemetery itself. Loos Village sits in a bit of a hollow. There's a small museum in the town hall that's worth going to see. There is the Loos British Cemetery, which has now got a new extension, which we've done a previous podcast on. And as you get beyond Loos, coming up onto Hill 70, you're coming into that ground that was known as the Field of Corpses, where some of the follow-up units in September 1915 went into the attack, men from the 21st and 24th Divisions, and suffered terrible casualties from the German defences that were in a kind of a U-shaped, with these Stützpunkts, these strong points that looked down onto this open ground, laid down heavy fire and caused catastrophic casualties to so many of the men and the units that tried to advance across that ground in 1915. So again, it's an area that I think we can get a lot from. I'm working on this book covering this bit of ground myself, but there are other Battleground Europe books covering the Loos area, covering some of these places that we've spoken about. The late John Cooksey wrote some really good guides to this part of the Western Front as well. So this is kind of different ground, not as well known, not as well trod as Ypres or the Somme, but really worth getting to grips with, I think, to understand how war fighting on the Western Front, the development of the offensive, began with these early battles, reaching a pinnacle with the Battle of Loos in September 1915, and the lessons learned from that would then obviously be applied onwards towards the next offensive, which would be the Somme in the following year in 1916. And as we stand on this southern boundary, and we're close to Lens, to Lens, just beyond that urban area is Vimy Ridge. And if you're on top of the observation platform at Dud Corner Cemetery, or standing on top of the double Crassier, you might get a glimpse of Vimy Ridge and Notre Dame de Lorette beyond. That's the next part of the Western Front. Again, bits of that not as well visited as other parts, but I think we've come to the end, the edge of the forgotten front where the fighting was, and now it's time to look at the ground behind the lines. When we discuss the landscape of the First World War in places like France and Flanders, it's easy just to focus on the areas where the fighting was, the very front lines. But the battlefield more than a century ago did not exist in isolation. It was only made possible by those long lines of logistics that fed it with men, with ammunition and war material. When I started looking at the Forgotten Front for the book that I'm writing on this part of the Western Front, I wanted to include something about those behind-the-lines areas because they are so important to our understanding of how the war was even possible. And I found myself drawn into a fascinating aspect of the Great War that when I came to write about it, so far it's one of the longest chapters in the book because there's just so much there. So when the British Army came to France in August 1914, some of its earliest units that arrived on French soil were not infantry, they were not cavalry, but they were support units like the Army Service Corps and the Royal Engineers. It invested in that infrastructure to make the front line possible from the very beginning and continued to do so for the rest of the conflict, creating this vast network of supply by 1918 from roadways to canals to railway transport systems, enabling the British Expeditionary Force, which by 1918 didn't just include men from Britain, but from every corner of that vast British Empire, now the Commonwealth, and it enabled the BEF to move everything it needed to fight and sustain its war and its units easily and fluidly across northern France. When the British sector of trench lines was established in 1914-15, as we've said, running from Saint-Éloi, south of Ypres, to the Bassée canal area, the army looked at that area behind the front to find what it needed to keep its men in these newly dug trenches in this static war that the Great War had become. That meant it needed ports to bring shipping into, to bring new men to fight that war, and to bring ammunition and supplies and everything else that would be needed. It needed main towns in that area that it could use as jumping off points to get to that battlefield area, to create command and control centres, signalling, and also use buildings that could be made available to treat the wounded, for example. It needed transport networks, whether that was road, rail or canal, and it found them all in plentiful numbers in this area beyond the Forgotten Front, back up towards the coast. From the ports of Boulogne and Calais to the towns inland like Saint-Omer, Lillers, Aire-sur-la-Lys and Bethune, to the old Roman roads that had once taken legionnaires from Gaul to Britain, to the often medieval canals which would become the waterways of supply and medical evacuation, to the railways which crisscross the countryside and the coal mining areas and industrial landscapes of this part of France, railways which would carry British trains manned by special British personnel from the Railway Operating Division. It was an area that the ordinary soldier found he could get lost in too. So it wasn't all about fighting. Soldiers didn't spend all of their time in the very front line. They spent a lot of time out on rest, even from the early periods of the war. And the quiet towns and the villages behind that front with their estaminets and the French people that they met, which to boys from Barnsley or country lads from the South Downs would have felt like they were from a world apart, meeting these people from rural northern France, so different to them in many respects, but a lot of commonality as well in terms of human nature, kindness, and the way they treated each other. But these soldiers, when you read their memoirs, they valued their time there. They valued that time away from the front in this vast area between the front line and the coast, exploring, discovering, talking to people and forging relations of all kinds, and perhaps finding an escape from the war for a while. It became a part of the front, behind the front, that perhaps meant just as much, if not more, to them than the battlefields where so many of their comrades had died. The towns and villages proved that they had everything that the soldiers of all nations that would come there, as the wider empire came to the Forgotten Front too, it had everything that they needed, from food to young women, shops to buy extras, and studios to have your photograph taken on active service. And those photographs taken in places like Bethune, where there were a lot of photographic studios, they look very different to the images of British Tommies that we see in training. They're images that I've always been drawn to in decades of collecting original images of the First World War, coming across those active service photographs where the men are in one of these studios behind the front. I think it gives us an insight into how they looked and how they felt about being there. You can sense a great deal of pride. You can sense that they're now part of a wider army, and they've been on active service. They've done their training, but they've now proved themselves. And you can see that sometimes in their demeanour, I think, when you look at these photographs. And again, that's kind of a subject for another podcast, perhaps. But as well as soldiers having free time to roam, the army, when it looked at this area, it needed it as part of its infrastructure, as we said. So it created vast depots here to store food, to store equipment, war material and ammunition, and then having the means by which to move them. And if you'd have come into this back area at any point during the war, it wasn't just the rumble of gunfire in the distance that have told you that a war was going on. You'd have seen evidence of the war everywhere, with columns of men marching to and from the front line and vehicles of all types moving this material, ammunition, food, water, everything, moving it around. But it wasn't just one-way traffic. It wasn't just about feeding the war, although that was its principal reason for all this infrastructure, to give the men the ammunition, to give them the bombs, the bullets and the bayonets to continue to fight. And then when there were losses, put more men into the field and continue with the fight. But of course, when there were losses, this is when it becomes two-way traffic, because those losses, those casualties, the wounded, and then in periods when there's not a lot going on, the sick as well, because when there were cold conditions in the front line, many soldiers would get sick. They came back to this area, back through this area, to be treated in the medical facilities. So as the war was fed, the casualties, the broken men from the battlefield would be brought back the other way to the dressing stations, the casualty clearing stations, and the field hospitals nearer the coast, established right across this region. And it became an area from the very beginning where women did their bit too, from nursing in the medical establishments to later labouring with the Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps and tending to the graves of the fallen. And I think in 1914, when the British Army first moved into this area, the thought of so many women being involved in military units serving on this area behind the front would have been unthinkable, really. But by 1918, the war had changed everything, including women's role in the military. And because of the medical facilities, cemeteries abound in this area too, of men who died of their wounds, women, some of those women who served in the different units that were here, killed in bombing raids in the latter part of the war, or who went on to die of influenza as influenza swept across Europe in the autumn of 1918 on into the spring of the following year. And these are cemeteries that often, when we visit them in this area behind the lines, reflect the culture of the day in the way that frontline cemeteries don't. So when you are constructing a cemetery that is near to a field hospital, you can create different plots. And what you find is cemeteries with Jewish plots, with separate plots for officers, so kind of keeping up the class system. And when women are killed, they're normally buried with the officers because they're seen in that same kind of status. I remember reading an account that said, we can't have women just buried with the men. That wouldn't be right and proper. I mean, that's obviously the kind of culture, the mindset of more than a century ago. And the cemeteries also tend to be in chronological order, so you can often see the effects of the fighting on the medical establishments in these areas by coming across rows and rows of graves, all with dates very, very close together, often indicating, reflecting an offensive taking place on the front line. Because the cemeteries contain a much higher proportion of identified soldiers, so on a battlefield, many soldiers, their identity discs, their pay books will have been removed, bodies are found later, there's no way of telling who they are, and they're buried as unknowns. These are cemeteries created largely from medical facilities, so a man comes in from the front and he's still got his dog tags on, he's got his pay book, he's got his personal papers, so the chances of him being unidentifiable are pretty slim. Now there are some, but that's a pretty rare occurrence. So because of the fact that these are mainly identified soldiers, what they do when we look at them, because we know who they are, what kind of backgrounds they came from, what units they were with, it gives us this fascinating insight into the men and women and units that operated behind the lines in this sector during the Great War, and indeed the nationalities involved, which become more and more numerous as the war goes on. And by 1918, just about every corner of the British Empire is represented amongst those who are operating in this area behind the Forgotten Front. And as well, this area was a place where commanders commanded. It was a place where, for example, Sir John French, the original Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force in 1914-15, had a headquarters in Saint-Omer. And across the region, Army, Corps and Division headquarters were set up in all kinds of different buildings, from old barracks to schools to old citadels, and they were all used by these different units as the war progressed. And by 1918, within those headquarters, many had women personnel working as clerks. So again, this was a massive turning point in the history of the British Armed Forces. While many believe the army never really learned anything during the Great War, especially when we watch things like Blackadder, great comedy, it's not a documentary, this vast area behind the Forgotten Front also contained large numbers of training schools. The Artist Rifles, for example, established one of the first machine gun schools near Saint-Omer in 1915, but later, as training became much more formalised, specialist schools were established which trained soldiers to use weapons, from rifles to machine guns to bayonets, trench mortars, to train them against the effects of poison gas. So there'd be gas training schools where soldiers went to learn about the latest gas equipment that soldiers carried, from masks to smallpox respirators. There were areas where they'd learn tactics, trench fighting, trench clearing, trench raiding, all that kind of stuff. And then specialist schools to enhance their skills, such as signalling schools that were established behind the front, and much, much more. So you can see how big and complex this infrastructure was getting as the war went on. And training in the British Army really reached its peak in 1918 with a vast conscript army that needed training like this to fight and win the battles it fought in those final weeks of the conflict. But while those crisscross paths in this region of northern France, behind the front line of the Forgotten Front, could have taken a Tommy everywhere and anywhere, in the distance, that far distance, like a long forgotten thunder, was the rumble of the guns, the rumble of the barrage, the real war, that massive engine of conflict fed by men and metal, that forgotten front, that part of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.